All right, guys, so we're going to continue our discussion now, and we're going to go on to discuss the spinal cord. So spinal cord is pretty detailed processes. So again, just a reminder, it's a part of the central nervous system, and really what its job is relay messages from the brain to the rest of the body. So the spinal cord extends from the base of the brain into about the first lumbar vertebrae. A bundle of nerve roots called the quada equina extends from the end of the spinal cord. So it does continue kind of from there, but it's really just a nerve root bundle. There are 31 pairs of spinal nerves, and they branch out from the spinal cord. They're divided into regions. Nerves from the cervical region innervate or go to the chest, head, neck, shoulders, arms, hands, and diaphragm. So if people have an injury there, it's going to affect those parts of the body and anything below it. Nerves from the thoracic region extend to the intercostal muscles of the rib cage, the abdominal muscles, and the back muscles. The lumbar spinal nerves innervate the lower abdominal wall and parts of the thighs and legs. And the nerves from the sacral region extend to the thighs, buttocks, muscles, skin of the legs and feet, and the anal and genitalia region. So we need to think about that when we talk about patients who have spinal cord injuries. So here really is the end of the spinal cord, and then this is really kind of that nerve root bundle. So it still kind of continues down and branches off. So here's the structure of the spinal cord. We talked about vertebrae in our skeletal muscular lecture, and one of the functions of that was to protect the spinal cord. So now we're going to actually talk about the structure of the spinal cord. It really sits inside these stacked vertebrae. Remember, here's the vertebral body. That's actually what bears the weight of the body. And then in the middle here is where we have the actual spinal cord. So this is a cross-section view, and it shows two different types of nervous tissue. It shows white matter and gray matter. Gray matter appears gray because of its lack of myelin. So there's no myelin sheaths here. It contains mostly cell bodies of motor neurons and interneurons. This H-shaped mass is divided into two sets of horns. We have the posterior horns and the ventral horns. Okay, so you can see that here. It kind of looks like horns on that structure there. The white matter appears white because of its abundance of myelin. It contains bundles of axons called tracts that carry impulses from one part of the nervous system to another. Then we have this central canal here, and that carries cerebral spinal fluid through the spinal cord. We'll talk about that in more detail. And then the epidural space lies between the outer covering of the spinal cord and the vertebrae. It contains a cushioning layer of fat, as well as blood vessels and connective tissue. So here's this epidural space here. Just another protective kind of mechanism. And then we have gray matter and white matter. Attachment of the spinal nerves and the different sections of the meninges I want to talk about here. Okay, so the spinal nerves travel through gaps between the vertebrae and attach to the spinal cord by way of the dorsal and ventral roots that we just talked about. The dorsal nerve root contains fibers that carry sensory information into the spinal cord. So you see here it's carrying information into the spinal cord. It enters the dorsal horn of the spinal cord. The cell bodies of the dorsal neurons are clustered in knot-like structures called ganglion. Okay, so that's what you're seeing here. So this sends sensory information into the spinal cord. Fibers in the ventral nerve roots exit from the ventral horn to carry motor information out of the nerve, out of the spinal cord, excuse me. A spinal nerve is a single nerve resulting from the fusion of dorsal and ventral nerve root. So once they combine over here, this is what we actually call a spinal nerve. It contains both sensory and motor fibers, meaning it can transmit impulses in two directions, and it's called a mixed nerve. Okay, so you need to know the dorsal root brings the sensory information in. This ventral root here brings the motor, contains motor neurons and brings the information out of the spinal cord. The other things I want to talk about here is these meninges. So the spinal cord is protected by the bony vertebrae and by three layers of fibrous connective tissue called meninges. The three layers are the pia mater, the arachnoid matter, and the dura mater. So the pia mater is the innermost layer. It is a transparent membrane that clings to the surface of the brain and spinal cord. We're going to talk about these again when we talk about the structures of the brain. They'll be in the same exact fashion. So the pia mater contains blood vessels. The arachnoid matter lies between the dura mater and the pia mater. It is a delicate layer resembling a cobweb. The dura mater is the tough outer layer. The subarachnoid space here lies between the arachnoid matter and the pia mater, and it's filled with cerebral spinal fluid. So I just want to show you these spinal tracts. You do not need to memorize these different tracts here, but I do want to talk about it. We just kind of mentioned it, that bundles of axons called tracts lie within the white matter. They serve as routes of communication to and from the brain. All nerve fibers in a single tract have a similar origination, destination, and function. So we have ascending tracts. They convey sensory signals up the spinal cord to the brain. And we have descending tracts, and they conduct motor impulses down the spinal cord to the skeletal muscle. So just like we had the dorsal and ventral roots here that bring signals in and send signals out, the same way. So we have ascending tracts that go up the spinal cord, bring those sensory impulses to the brain, and we have descending tracts that bring those impulses back down. We send it back out here, and it goes out to the skeletal muscles and produces the reaction that we want it to. Spinal nerves we just talked about, and those are just, in general, a group of nerve fibers encased by connective tissue. What they actually do is relay information from the spinal cord to the rest of the body. So we were just talking about those coming off of the dorsal and ventral root here, and it's a mixed fiber. So it has sensory and motor neurons in it, so it can conduct impulses towards and away from the spinal cord. The spinal nerves are differentiated just like the different sections of the spinal cord. So if we remember those from previous lecture, we'll be able to connect those to the spinal nerve. So there's 31 pairs, and there's 8 cervical, which is a change. So there's only 7 cervical vertebrae, but there is 8 cervical nerves, because the first cervical nerve exits the spinal cord between the skull and the axis. So then there's 7 more below that for each vertebrae. So there's 12 thoracic, 5 lumbar, 5 sacral, and 1 going to the coccyx, because that's a fused section there. So I just want you to know the differences here. You don't have to know, all of where these go and what they do. I just want you to know the different sections. One last thing I want to talk about here is somatic reflexes. And this is what happens when we go to the doctor and they check our reflexes. So you don't need to know the steps here, but I want you to be able to understand the difference between somatic reflexes and autonomic reflexes, which we're going to talk about later. So these reflexes are quick, involuntary, predictable responses to a stimulus. Okay? Reflexes use this neural circuit called a reflex arc. The reflex arc bypasses regions of the brain where conscious decisions are made. This is why when they tap on our knee with that little hammer and our leg jerks, we don't really have control over that. Versus autonomic reflexes, which we're going to talk about, involve secretion from glands or the contraction of smooth muscle. And these are really governed by autonomic neurons. We don't really, again, have much control over those, but those are for our internal kind of organs, versus somatic reflexes are all in relation to skeletal muscle. So let's watch this quick animation on this to give you some more details. And again, remember, you don't have to know all these steps. I just want you to be able to understand the differences here.
Reflexes are a quick, involuntary, predictable response to a stimulus. Reflexes use a neural circuit called a reflex arc, which bypasses regions of the brain where conscious decisions are made. Somatic reflexes involve the contraction of a skeletal muscle after being stimulated by a somatic motor neuron. Patellar reflex is a somatic reflex commonly tested during physical examinations to identify certain diseases. Somatic receptors, located in the skin, a muscle, or a tendon, detect a sensation such as the stretching of the thigh muscle when the patellar tendon is tapped. Afferent, sensory, nerve fibers send a signal directly to the spinal cord. The impulse immediately passes to a motor neuron. It bypasses regions of the brain where conscious decisions are made. The motor neuron initiates an impulse back to the muscle, causing it to contract, producing a slight kick in the lower leg.
So I wanted to just talk about reflexes so you understand the difference, because it's not a normal kind of sensory motor neuron pathway, because it really bypasses the brain. So that's one of the key features of reflexes.